Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm watching Why Didn't the Dutch Also Scramble Africa by History Matters. I don't know for sure, but I think the reasons why they didn't is because they believed the East Indies to be more profitable, Indonesia. And they also probably just couldn't compete with other European nations that were also scrambling Africa. But those are just my guesses. Let's see the actual reasons.
Of all the European imperial powers, the Dutch were one of the most successful, exploring and discovering lands unknown to Europeans, establishing lucrative trading networks, as well as creating a long-lasting colonial empire across many continents. The building of said globe-spanning empire came at the same time as many of its neighbouring rivals were doing the same. However, by the time of the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, when the Europeans were turning their full attention to the division and colonisation of Africa, the Dutch were essentially nowhere
Just
to be seen, and
salivating
after
at
all
the
was
mouth.
said and done, their territory in Africa was, well, non-existent. Which raises the question, why didn't the Dutch also take part in the scramble for Africa? Why didn't the Netherlands set up colonies there? Now, I can already hear some of you shouting in the comments about the fact that whilst the Dutch didn't take part in the scramble for Africa, they did of course grab some of it for themselves beforehand.
Yeah, they did have some.
This was done in the mid-17th century when the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, took control of the Cape of Good Hope here, the purpose of the latter being to establish a midpoint between the Netherlands and Europe and its colonial holdings in East Asia. Over the following century, the Dutch Empire grew in size and
I was going to
Colony did
pause and
too.
mention that.
Now, there were growing tensions between the Dutch East India Company and the settlers there over what rights and freedoms those living in Cape Colony had. Well, the Dutch and European settlers who lived there, that is. The slaves, not so much. Grumblings aside, the colony steadily grew in territory and population, much to the annoyance of those living nearby, and by the late 18th century, Dutch holdings in Africa were well established and had the largest footprint of any European power on the continent. So what
But
changed
then the
over
British
the next
took
90
it.
years that meant that not only did the Dutch lose what they already had in Africa, but also meant that they would never return to the continent? Well, the main reason was France, sort of. Or more accurately, it was the French Revolution and the instability that spread across Europe in its wake. However, in the lead up to Louis XVI's departure from politics, the Dutch had been in a bit of a period of
Departure
decline.
from politics.
So one of the Dutch secrets to success had been its ability to better finance its overseas expansion and its wars versus its rivals. But as the other European empires grew in size and population, the Dutch weren't as able to keep up. And other states, notably England, whose king had been ousted from power by the Dutch stadtholder William III, who was crowned King William also III, was now able to financially compete. The two were thus closely aligned after this, but England's empire wealth and resources grew at a pace that was simply too fast for the Dutch. And England, later Britain,
they
soon
couldn't
became
compete
the primary
with
naval
other
and commercial
European
power in
powers.
Europe. The 18th century also saw the Dutch Republic become much more unstable, and periods of poor rule and defeat in important wars led to major upheavals there. William IV, the Prince of Orange, rose to power as the revived stadtholder in 1747, and sought to halt the decline and return the country to glory. Unfortunately, he died in 1751 because I assume he thought that leaving a toddler in charge would be hilarious. The years following saw the Netherlands decline further, due to corruption, internal squabbling, and its rivals continuing to grow at a faster pace. And in the 1770s, when Britain's North American colonies revolted, the Dutch wanted to maintain their trade links there. The British were less keen on this and wanted to make sure that the Dutch weren't supplying the American rebels with weapons on behalf of France. When the Netherlands made it clear that it was going to join a Russian-led naval alliance to stop this from happening, the British declared war. Now you'd think that with Britain fighting against the rebels, the French and also the Spanish, that the Dutch would have an easy time, but fun fact, no. The Dutch Republic did not do well, because its navy was too small to do anything, thereby leaving the British free to attack Dutch colonies overseas. The Dutch had refused to join a formal alliance with the French and the Spanish, which meant that even though Britain lost the war against those, the French refused to support any of the Dutch demands, meaning that it was forced to sign a separate peace in 1784, one which led to the Dutch giving territory to Britain and making trade concessions too.
Barely
After
a change,
this loss,
though.
the Netherlands again became much more unstable, and revolts against the stadtholder soon erupted. These were quickly suppressed with help from the Prussians, but the resentment still remained, meaning that when the French Revolution began shortly afterwards, the Netherlands was yet again destabilised. Dutch leadership weren't keen on these revolutionary ideals and so joined an anti-French coalition to restore the French monarchy and return things to normal. This did not go to plan, and the French were soon victorious, having invaded the Netherlands and with the help of the formerly suppressed revolutionaries, overthrew the stadtholder and declared the birth of the Batavian Republic. This put the Dutch firmly in the French camp, and thus against Britain, who didn't want the Dutch Empire's resources to aid the French, and so
And that's when they took it.
Including the Dutch Cape Colony.
Yeah.
Britain returned it after making peace with France, but when Napoleon happened, the British conquered it again, and during this time the Netherlands was ruled as a puppet state and also briefly annexed into France. Prior to Napoleon's defeat, the great powers had agreed that William VI, the Prince of Orange, would become the king of a much larger United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and the British felt that giving William
Which includes modern-day Belgium.
a larger state meant that he wouldn't mind losing some of his overseas holdings. He did of course, but the British didn't care, and in 1814 they signed a treaty acknowledging that Britain would keep these. This notably included Cape Colony, thereby ending the largest Dutch settlement on the continent, but it's okay because they still had the Gold Coast. The next half a century was a mixed bag for the Netherlands. Internal divisions
Well,
meant
they
that a mere
didn't keep
15
that
years after its
for
formation,
much
the
longer
United Kingdom
either.
of the Netherlands split into two. becoming the Kingdom of the Netherlands in union with Luxembourg and the now independent Kingdom of Belgium. It wasn't all bad though, because the Dutch took this time to modernise their economy and increase their income from the Dutch East Indies, which meant that the country would soon get a lot richer. The Dutch were expanding their holdings in Southeast Asia at this time, where their main competition was the British. In 1871, the Dutch agreed to cede the Dutch Gold Coast to Britain in return for it recognising its recent gains in Asia, and an acknowledgement in the Netherlands' interests in these parts too. And with this, the Netherlands had ended its over 250-year rule there and withdrawn from Africa entirely. It wasn't long after this until the near general desire amongst the European great powers to conquer Africa really kicked off. In order to lay the ground rules and hopefully prevent a major war,
So I guess I was correct in the beginning.
The Chancellor called the Berlin Conference to get the major powers on board. The conference was attended by all of these European states and the US, and the Netherlands, despite no longer having any formal holdings in Africa, wanted to protect its trade interests along the west coast and in particular in the region of the Congo, which King Leopold II of Belgium had truly put himself in a position to be awarded by the great powers, providing everyone could trade there. Now you'd think that the Dutch, who had previous experience there and also currently had an empire of their own, would have been a better candidate for this. However, the reason why the Netherlands not only wasn't awarded the Congo or even a small part of it was because Dutch leadership simply wasn't interested in colonising Africa, and what little interests it had there were outweighed by the potential downsides. You see, the Dutch government's primary imperial focus was the islands of Southeast Asia, the conquest and pacification of which was already difficult enough. In fact, one of the reasons why the Netherlands handed over the Gold Coast to Britain was the British protest over the Dutch taking the people there to fight in their wars of colonial expansion, which didn't seem very voluntary to those in London and thus looked suspiciously like a form of enslavement. And so, given that the Dutch could no longer take African soldiers to fight their wars, there was very little there to interest them, save of course for their historical connection to the Dutch descendants living in British Cape Colony. Now, whilst there was a powerful cultural connection with the Boers, the Dutch knew that settling anywhere near the southern tip of Africa was just asking for trouble.
Yeah,
and despite the simmering
just
imperial
not worth the
rivalry
trouble
between the two, Britain was a major trading partner with a similar system of government and a nation which the Dutch saw as their most likely ally should another major European war break out, which meant that upsetting them wasn't the best idea. Furthermore, the ever-growing Dutch East Indies were a much greater source of wealth for Amsterdam than Africa could have ever been. To begin, it had an absolutely massive population that the Dutch could make use of. To put just how big it was into perspective, the population there was roughly 32 million people at this point, which was larger than the populations of all the other European colonial empires combined, barring Britain's of course. The Dutch East Indies were also perfect for growing lucrative cash crops and was also situated along important sea routes. The Dutch government also knew that it holding onto these islands was seen as the best case scenario by the other European powers, who much preferred the wealth of these islands going to the Netherlands instead of any of their rivals. And so, instead of laying claim to any section of Africa and potentially upsetting any of the great powers, the Dutch agreed to the rules laid down at the Berlin Conference and opted for a policy of supporting Britain and Belgium's claims there, believing that those two would be much more likely to give them access to markets which would increase the Netherlands' already growing wealth. Within 20 years, the vast majority of Africa had been claimed, whilst the Dutch had made further inroads into Southeast Asia, a decision which, whilst in some respects abandoning their past connections to Africa, was economically and politically very beneficial for the Netherlands, and one which helped in keeping the country out of war for the next 50 years.
So I guess I was kind of right in the beginning. Two of the reasons were simply because the Dutch East Indies were much more profitable, and because they simply couldn't compete with other European powers which were also scrambling Africa. Yeah, I don't really have much to add here. This video felt a little longer than it needed to be, but that's just my opinion. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here. And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.